Hello, friends. Welcome back to Angareji Sahitya, the channel where we explore the fascinating world of English literature in a simple and engaging way. Today, we are going to discuss one of the most influential literary theories of the 20th century, reader response theory. Friends, this theory shifts the focus from the author or the text to the reader, highlighting the idea that literature does not have one fixed meaning. Instead, meaning is created when the reader interacts with the text. So, let's dive right in. So, friends, let's see what is reader response theory. Reader response theory is a way of looking at literature that says there is no single fixed meaning hidden inside a book. Instead, the meaning is created when you, as a reader, interact with the text. Friends, think of a book like a script for a play. The words on the page are important, but the performance only comes alive when the actors bring their own expressions, emotions, and imagination. In the same way, a story or a poem only comes alive when a reader engages with it. Friends, your background, your experiences, and even your mood while reading will influence what you take away from it. Let's make it clearer with an example of George Orwell's famous novel Animal Farm. On the surface, it is a simple story about animals on a farm who rise up against their human owner. Now, one reader may just enjoy it as a fun fable about animals rebelling for freedom. But another reader who knows about history and politics might immediately see it as a sharp satire on communism and the Russian Revolution. Friends, so the same book is giving two completely different experiences. One about talking animals and one about political history. Which one is correct? Reader response theory says both are correct because meaning is not looked inside the text. It is created in the interaction between the text and the reader. In short, reader response theory reminds us that literature is not a one way street where the author tells us what to think. It's a two-way conversation where the reader plays an equal important role in creating meaning. Friends, now let's discuss types of reader response criticism. Reader response theory is not just one single approach, it is a collection of perspectives developed by different critics. Let's look at the major ones. And let's begin with transactional theory by Louis Rosenblatt. Friends, Louis Rosenblatt, an important figure in reader response criticism, explained reading as a transaction between the text and the reader. By transaction, she meant that reading is not just the reader passively absorbing words from the page, nor is it the text alone dictating meaning. Instead, it is a kind of back and forth exchange where both the text and the reader contribute to creating meaning. Friends, to make this clearer, Rosenblatt described two different modes of reading. The first is efferent reading. This happens when we read to extract information or facts. For example, when you read a newspaper article to know today's headlines, or when you go through a science textbook to prepare for an exam, you are doing different reading. In this mode, the main focus is on what information you can take away from the text, not on how it makes you feel. The second is aesthetic reading. This is when we read to immerse ourselves in the experience, the emotions, and the imagination that the text offers. For example, think about the time you got lost in a novel like Harry Potter or felt deeply moved by a poem like Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. Friends, in aesthetic reading, the joy comes not from gathering facts, but from living through the words, imagining the scenes and feeling the emotions. Rosenblatt's key point is that texts do not carry a fixed meaning inside them. They only become meaningful when a reader engages with them, either efferently or aesthetically. A textbook sitting on a shelf or a poem lying unread is just ink on paper. It turns into knowledge, beauty, or emotion only when someone reads it with attention. So, in short, Rosenblatt's transactional theory reminds us that meaning is created through this active partnership between the reader and the text. The text provides the words, but the reader provides the life, the imagination, and the emotional response. Friends, let's see the affective stylistics by Stanley Fish. Stanley Fish, one of the most influential voices in reader response theory, argued that meaning is not something hidden inside the text, like a secret treasure waiting to be discovered. Instead, meaning is created as a process in the reader's mind while reading. Friends, according to him, every sentence, every word unfolds step by step in time, and the reader is constantly building, adjusting, and sometimes even revising their understanding as they move through the text. For example, imagine reading the opening line of a mystery novel. The door creaked open and she froze. At this moment, you might imagine suspense, danger, or even a ghostly figure. But as you continue reading and discover that it's just her cat walking in, your interpretation changes. Fish says this constant shaping and reshaping of meaning during the act of reading is where literature truly exists. But Fish didn't stop there. He also introduced the concept of interpretive communities. Friends, he argued that no reading happens in isolation. Our interpretations are shaped by the groups or communities we belong to. These communities include our culture, religion, education, and even profession. Friends, for example, a group of literature students analyzing John Donne's poetry might focus on its metaphors, historical context, and literary devices. Meanwhile, a group of casual readers might simply enjoy the emotional intensity of the poem without worrying about technical analysis. Similarly, someone from the religious background might interpret a sacred text with deep spiritual meaning, while an academic might read the same text critically, focusing on history or language. Friends, in short, Stanley Fish theory tells us two things. First, meaning is not fixed in the text but is created dynamically as we read. And second, our interpretations are not purely personal, they are shaped by the communities we belong to. That's why two groups of readers can approach the same text and walk away with completely different, yet equally valid meanings. So, friends, the next is the implied reader theory by Wolfgang Iser. Friends, Wolfgang Iser, another key figure in reader response theory, explained that whenever an author writes a text, they already have a kind of ideal reader in mind. He called this the implied reader. Friends, this does not mean a real person, but rather a role that any actual reader takes up while reading. The implied reader is someone who is ready to engage with the text in the way the author has set it up. Iser also highlighted that texts are never completely finished products. Instead, they contain gaps or blanks, places where the author deliberately leaves something unsaid or open ended. It is the reader's job to fill these gaps using their imagination, logic, and emotion. This makes reading an active process of cooperation between the writer and the reader. Friends, think of a detective novel. The author doesn't spell out the solution on page 1. Instead, they give you fragments, clues, hints, and suspicious behavior. The reader has to connect the dots, suspect characters, and build possible outcomes in their mind before the final revelation. That act of filling in the blanks is what Iser is talking about. Friends, another example could be Shakespeare's plays. When you read Macbeth, Shakespeare does not explain exactly what Lady Macbeth is thinking when she sleepwalks and rubs her hands. The gap leaves space for readers and actors to interpret her guilt, her madness, and her inner conflict in different ways. Even in modern novels or movies, we see this all the time. A filmmaker may end a movie with an ambiguous ending, like Inception with the spinning top. Is the character still dreaming or awake? The film doesn't answer. The audience fills that gap with their own interpretation. Friends, So, Iser's theory of the implied reader reminds us that texts are designed to invite participation. Authors create structures that guide us, but they also leave spaces for us to complete the meaning. Reading, therefore, is not passive. It is like solving a puzzle where the author provides the pieces and the reader puts them together. Now, let's understand subjective criticism by David Bleich. Friends, David Bleich took reader response theory in a very radical direction. While other critics like Iser and Rosenblatt still believe that the text plays an important guiding role, Bleich argued that meaning exists only in the mind of the reader. In other words, the text itself doesn't contain meaning at all. It's just marks on a page. The true meaning is created entirely by the individual reader when they respond to those marks. Friends, according to Bleach, this means there is no such thing as an objective meaning of a text. Two readers can read the same poem or novel and walk away with completely different interpretations. And both are equally valid because meaning is nothing more than the response generated inside each person's mind. For example, imagine a poem about a rainy day. One reader who loves rain might feel comfort, peace, and nostalgia, interpreting the poem as something joyful. Another reader who recently went through a sad breakup might connect rain with sorrow and loneliness, interpreting the same poem as deeply tragic. According to Bleach, both interpretations are correct because what truly matters is the reader's personal reaction, not some fixed meaning hidden in the poem. Bleach also emphasized that when readers share their responses, say in a classroom discussion, meaning is created collectively. In this way, literature becomes not just about the text, but about the conversation between readers and the emotions and ideas they bring to it. Friends, so in short, Bleach's subjective criticism tells us that texts do not carry meaning on their own. Every interpretation, whether happy, sad, critical, or even unusual, is valid as long as it honestly reflects the reader's response. Friends, now let's see the psychological approach by Norman Holland. Friends, Norman Holland added a psychological dimension to reader response theory. He believed that our personal psychology and identity, the unique mix of our personality, past experiences, emotion, and even unconscious desires, shapes how we read and interpret literature. In simple terms, he argued that when we read, we don't just take meaning from the text, we project ourselves into it. According to Holland, literature acts like a kind of mirror. When we engage with a story, a poem, or even a play, we often see reflection of our own inner world, our hopes, our fears, and our hidden emotions. Friends, different readers project different parts of themselves onto the same text, which is why interpretations vary so widely. For example, let's take Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. A reader who struggles with feelings of isolation might sympathize with the monster and see the novel as a story about loneliness and rejection. Another reader, perhaps a scientist, might read it as a warning about the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. A parent might interpret it as a cautionary tale about responsibility and the consequences of neglecting one's child. Friends, the same book becomes many different things, depending on what each reader brings from their own psychological background. We can see this in everyday life too. Imagine watching a romantic movie. Someone who is happily in love might see it as uplifting and heartwarming, but someone who has just gone through heartbreak might find the exact same movie sad, painful, or even frustrating. The difference isn't in the film, it's in the viewer's personal psychology. Friends, Holland's theory highlights that reading is not just about the text, it's about the reader's identity. Literature becomes a tool for self expression and self discovery because as we interpret stories, we reveal parts of ourselves. In short, Norman Holland's psychological approach shows us that interpretation is never neutral. It's deeply personal, shaped by who are we, what we have experienced, and what we feel inside. Friends, now let's understand why reader response theory matters. Friends, Reader response theory is important because it shifts the focus from the author or the text alone to the reader's active role in creating meaning. In traditional literary theories, a text was often seen as a finished product with one fixed interpretation, waiting to be uncovered by a critic. Reader response theory challenges this idea. It shows us that literature is not a closed message with a single final answer, but rather an open conversation between the text and its audience. The meaning emerges from this interaction. This perspective also explains why classic works of literature continue to resonate across generations. Think about Shakespeare, Milton, or Jane Austen. People still read their works today, not because their meaning has remained the same for hundreds of years, but because each new generation finds fresh significance in their stories. For example, readers in Shakespeare's time may have focused on political intrigue in Macbeth, while modern readers might be more interested in psychological depth or feminist interpretation. Similarly, Jane Austen's novel can be seen as romantic comedies, critiques of social norms, or exploration of women independence, depending on who is reading them and when. Friends, reader response theory also makes literature democratic. It gives equal value to every reader's response, not just those of professional critics or scholars. Imagine a classroom discussion. A student's personal interpretation of a poem is just as valid as an academic's detailed analysis because both reflect real engagement with the text. Even casual readers outside classroom, people reading novels or watching films, are participating in this creation of meaning. Friends, reader response theory reminds us that literature lives in the minds of its readers. Every reaction, every emotional response, every interpretation contributes to the life of a text. It empowers readers to see themselves as co creators of meaning, making the experience of literature personal, dynamic, and inclusive. So, friends, today we have explored reader response theory, a literary approach that emphasizes the role of the reader in shaping meaning. We learned how thinkers like Louise Rosenblatt, Wolfgang Iser, Stanley Fish, Norman Holland, and David Bleich developed different approaches to show that meaning is not fixed but created through reading. What do you think? Does the meaning of a book depend more on the writer or on the reader? Share your thoughts in the comments because in reader response theory, your response is what matters most. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Angareji Sahitya for more deep and easy to understand exploration of English literature. See you in the next video.